This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Napoleon of Notting Hill by G.K. Chesterton. Dedication to Hilaire Belloc. For every tiny town or place God made the stars especially. Babies look up with owlish face and see them tangled in a tree. You saw a moon from Sussex Downs, a Sussex moon, untravelled still. I saw a moon that was the town's, the largest lamp on Campden Hill. Yea, heaven is everywhere at home, the big blue cap that always fits. And so it is, be calm, they come, to goal at last, my wandering wits. So is it with the heroic thing. This shall not end for the world's end. And though the sullen engines swing, be you not much afraid, my friend. This did not end by Nelson's urn, where an immortal England sits, nor where your tall young men in turn drank death like wine at Austerlitz. And when the pedants bade us mark what cold mechanic happenings must come, our souls said in the dark, belike, but there are likelier things. Likelier across these flats afar, these sulky levels smooth and free, the drum shall crash a waltz of war, and death shall dance with liberty. Likelier the barricades shall blare, slaughter below and smoke above, and death and hate and hell declare that men have found a thing to love. Far from your sunny upland set, I saw the dream, the streets I trod, the lit starlit streets shot out and met, the starry streets that point to God. This legend of an epic hour, a child I dreamed, and dream it still, under the great grey water tower that strikes the stars on Campden Hill. Gilbert Keith Chesterton. End of dedication. End of section 0. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Napoleon of Notting Hill by G.K. Chesterton. Section 1, Book 1, Chapter 1. Introductory Remarks on the Art of Prophecy. The human race, to which so many of my readers belong, has been playing at children's games from the beginning, and will probably do so till the end, which is a nuisance for the few people who grow up. And one of the games to which it is most attached is called Keep Tomorrow Dark, and which is also named by the rustics in Shropshire, I have no doubt, Cheat the Prophet. The players listen very carefully and respectfully to all that the clever men have to say about what is to happen in the next generation. The players then wait until all the clever men are dead, and bury them nicely. Then they go and do something else. That is all. For a race of simple tastes, however, it is great fun. For human beings, being children, have the childish wilfulness and childish secrecy, and they never have from the beginning of the world done what the wise men have seen to be inevitable. They stoned the false prophets, it is said, but they could have stoned true prophets with a greater and juster enjoyment. Individually, men may present a more or less rational appearance, eating, sleeping, and scheming. But humanity as a whole is changeful, mystical, fickle, delightful. Men are men, but man is a woman. But in the beginning of the 20th century, the game of Cheat the Prophet was made far more difficult than it ever had been before. The reason was that there were so many prophets and so many prophecies that it was difficult to elude all their ingenuities. When a man did something free and frantic and entirely his own, a horrible thought struck him afterwards. It might have been predicted. Whenever a duke climbed a lamp post, when a dean got drunk, he could not be really happy. He could not be certain that he was not fulfilling some prophecy. In the beginning of the 20th century you could not see the ground for clever men. They were so common that a stupid man was quite exceptional, and when they found him they followed him in crowds down the street and treasured him up and gave him some high post in the state. And all these clever men were at work giving accounts of what would happen in the next age, all quite clear, all quite keen-sighted and ruthless, and all quite different. And it seemed that the good old game of hoodwinking your ancestors could not really be managed this time, because the ancestors neglected meat and sleep and practical politics, so that they might meditate day and night on what their descendants would be likely to do. But the way the prophets of the 20th century went to work was this. They took something or another that was certainly going on in their time, and then said that it would go on more and more until something extraordinary happened. And very often they added that in some odd place that extraordinary thing had happened, and that it showed the signs of the times. Thus, for instance, there were Mr. H.G. Wells and others who thought that science would take charge of the future, and just as the motor car was quicker than the coach, so some lovely thing would be quicker than the motor car, and so on for ever. And there arose from their ashes Dr. Quilp, who said that a man could be sent on his machine so fast round the world that he could keep up a long chatty conversation in some old world village by saying a word of a sentence each time he came round. And it was said that the experiment had been tried on an apoplectic old major, who was sent round the world so fast that there seemed to be, to the inhabitants of some other star, a continuous band round the earth of white whiskers, red complexion, and tweeds, a thing like the ring of Saturn. And then there was the opposite school. There was Mr. Edward Carpenter, who thought that we should in a very short time return to nature and live simply and slowly as the animals do. And Edward Carpenter was followed by James Pickey, D.D., for Pocahontas College, who said that men were immensely improved by grazing or taking their food slowly and continuously after the manner of cows. And he said that he had, with the most encouraging results, turned city men out on all fours in a field covered with veal cutlets. Then Tolstoy and the humanitarians said that the world was growing more merciful, and therefore no one would ever desire to kill. And Mr. Mick not only became a vegetarian, but at length declared vegetarianism doomed, shedding, as he called it finely, the green blood of the silent animals, and predicted that men in a better age would live on nothing but salt. And then came the pamphlet from Oregon, where the thing was tried, the pamphlet called "Why Should Salt Suffer?" And there was more trouble. And on the other hand, some people were predicting the lines of kinship would become narrower and sterner. There was Mr. Cecil Rhodes, who thought that the one thing of the future was the British Empire, and that there would be a gulf between those who were of the Empire and those who were not, between the Chinaman in Hong Kong and the Chinaman outside, between the Spaniard on the Rock of Gibraltar and the Spaniard off it, similar to the gulf between man and the lower animals. And in the same way his impetuous friend Dr. Zoppi, the Paul of Anglo-Saxonism, carried it a bit further, and as a result of this view, cannibalism should be held to mean eating a member of the Empire, not eating one of the subject peoples, who should, he said, be killed without needless pain. His horror at the idea of eating a man in British Guiana showed how they misunderstood his stoicism, who thought him devoid of feeling. He was, however, in a hard position, as it was said that he had attempted the experiment, and, living in London, had to subsist entirely on Italian organ grinders. And his end was terrible, For just when he had begun, Sir Paul Swiller read his great paper at the Royal Society, proving that the savages were not only quite right in eating their enemies, but right on moral and hygienic grounds, since it was true that the qualities of the enemy, when eaten, passed into the eater. The notion that the nature of an Italian organ man was irrevocably growing and burgeoning inside him was almost more than the kindly old professor could bear. There was Mr. Benjamin Kidd, who said that the growing note of our race would be the care for and knowledge of the future. His idea was developed more powerfully by William Borker, who wrote that passage which every schoolboy knows by heart about men in future ages weeping by the graves of their descendants, and tourists being shown over the scene of the historic battle which was to take place some centuries afterwards. And Mr. Stead, too, was prominent, who thought that England would in the 20th century be united to America, and his young lieutenant, Graham Podge, who included the states of France, Germany, and Russia in the American Union, the state of Russia being abbreviated to R.A. There was Mr. Sidney Webb also, who said that the future would see a continuously increasing order and neatness in the life of the people, and his poor friend Phipps, who went mad and ran about the country with an axe, hacking branches off the trees wherever they were not the same number on both sides. All these clever men were prophesying with every variety of ingenuity what would happen soon, and they all did it in the same way, by taking something they saw going strong, as the saying is, and carrying it as far as ever their imaginations could stretch. This, they said, was the true and simple way of anticipating the future. Just as, said Dr. Pilkins in a fine passage, just as when we see a pig in a litter larger than the other pigs, we know that by an unalterable law of the inscrutable it will some day be larger than an elephant, just as we know when we see weeds and dandelions growing more and more thickly in a garden that they must, in spite of all our efforts, grow taller than the chimney-pots and swallow the house from sight. So we know and reverently acknowledge that when any power in human politics has shown for any period of time any considerable activity, it will go on until it reaches to the sky. And it did certainly appear that the prophets had put the people, engaged in the old game of cheat the prophet, in a quite unprecedented difficulty. It seemed really hard to do anything without fulfilling some of their prophecies. But there was nevertheless, in the eyes of labourers in the street, of peasants in the fields, of sailors and children, and especially women, a strange look that kept the wise men in a perfect fever of doubt. They could not fathom the motionless mirth in their eyes. They still had something up their sleeve. They were still playing the game of cheat the prophet. Then the wise men grew like wild things, and swayed hither and thither, crying, "What can it be? What can it be? What will London be like in a century hence? Is there anything we have not thought of? Houses upside down, more hygienic perhaps, men walking on hands, make feet flexible, don't you know? Moon, motor cars, no heads." And so they swayed and wondered till they died, and were buried nicely. Then the people went and did what they liked. Let me no longer conceal the painful truth. The people had cheated the prophets of the 20th century. When the curtain goes up on this story, 80 years after the present date, London is almost exactly like what it is now. End of chapter 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Napoleon of Notting Hill, by G. K. Chesterton. Book 1, Chapter 2, The Man in Green. Very few words are needed to explain why London, 100 years hence, will be very like it is now, or rather, since I must slip into a prophetic past, why London, when my story opens, was very like it was in those enviable days when I was still alive. The reason can be stated in one sentence. The people had absolutely lost faith in revolutions. All revolutions are doctrinal, such as the French one, or the one that introduced Christianity. For it stands to common sense that you cannot upset all existing things, customs, and compromises, unless you believe in something outside them, something positive and divine. Now England during this century lost all belief in this. It believed in a thing called evolution, and it said, all theoretic changes have ended in blood and ennui. If we change, we must change slowly and safely, as the animals do. Nature's revolutions are the only successful ones. There has been no conservative reaction in favour of tails. And some things did change. Things that were not much thought of dropped out of sight. Things that had not often happened did not happen at all. Thus, for instance, the actual physical force ruling the country, the soldiers and police, grew smaller and smaller, and at last vanished, almost to a point. The people combined could have swept the few policemen away in 10 minutes. They did not, because they did not believe it would do them the least good. They had lost faith in revolutions. Democracy was dead, for no one minded the governing class governing. England was now practically a despotism, but not an hereditary one. Someone in the official class was made king. No one cared how, no one cared who. He was merely a universal secretary. In this manner it happened that everything in London was very quiet. That vague and somewhat depressed reliance upon things happening as they have always happened, which is with all Londoners a mood, had become an assumed condition. There was really no reason for any man doing anything but the thing he had done the day before. There was therefore no reason whatever why the three young men who had always walked up to their government office together should not walk up to it together on this particular wintry and cloudy morning. Everything in that age had become mechanical, and government clerks especially. All those clerks assembled regularly at their posts. 3 of those clerks always walked into town together. All the neighbourhood knew them. 2 of them were tall and 1 short, and on this particular morning the short clerk was only a few seconds late to join the other 2 as they passed his gate. He could have overtaken them in 3 strides. He could have called after them easily, but he did not. For some reason that will never be understood until all souls are judged, if they are ever judged, the idea was at this time classed with fetish worship. He did not join his 2 companions, but walked steadily behind them. The day was dull, their dress was dull, everything was dull, but in some odd impulse he walked through street after street, through district after district, looking at the backs of the 2 men who would have swung round at the sound of his voice. Now there is a law written in the darkest of the books of life, and it is this: if you look at a thing 999 times, you are perfectly safe. If you look at it the 1000th time, you are in frightful danger of seeing it for the first time. So the short government official looked at the coat-tails of the tall government officials, and through street after street, and round corner after corner, saw only coat-tails, coat-tails, and again coat-tails. When he did not in the least know why, something happened to his eyes. 2 black dragons were walking backwards in front of him. 2 black dragons were looking at him with evil eyes. The dragons were walking backwards, it was true, but they kept their eyes fixed on him none the less. The eyes which he saw were in truth only the two buttons at the back of a frock coat. Perhaps some traditional memory of their meaningless character gave this half-witted prominence to their gaze. The slit between the tails was the nose-line of the monster. Whenever the tails flapped in the wintry wind, the dragons licked their lips. It was only a momentary fancy, but the small clerk found it embedded in his soul ever afterwards. He never could again think of men in frock coats except as dragons walking backwards. He explained afterwards, quite tactfully and nicely, to his two official friends, that while feeling an inexpressible regard for each of them, he could not seriously regard the face of either of them as anything but a kind of tail. It was, he admitted, a handsome tail, a tail elevated in the air. But if, he said, any true friend of theirs wished to see their faces, to look into the eyes of their soul, that friend must be allowed to walk reverently round behind them, so as to see them from the rear. There he would see the two black dragons with blind eyes. But when first the two black dragons sprang out of the fog upon the small clerk, they had merely the effect of all miracles. They changed the universe. He discovered the fact that all romantics know, that adventures happen on dull days, and not on sunny ones. When the cord of monotony is stretched most tight, then it breaks with a sound like song. He had scarcely noticed the weather before, but with the four dead eyes glaring at him, he looked round and realized the strange dead day. The morning was wintry and dim, not misty, but darkened with that shadow of cloud or snow which steeps everything in a green or copper twilight. The light there is on such a day seems not so much to come from the clear heavens, but to be a phosphorescence clinging to the shapes themselves. The load of heaven and the clouds is like the load of waters, and the men move like fishes, feeling that they are on the floor of a sea. Everything in a London street completes the fantasy. The carriages and cabs themselves resemble deep-sea creatures with eyes of flame. He had been startled at first to meet two dragons. Now he found he was among deep-sea dragons possessing the deep sea. The two young men in front were like the small young man himself, well dressed. The lines of their frock coats and silk hats had that luxuriant severity which marks the modern fop, hideous as he is, a favourite exercise of the modern draughtsman, that element which Mr. Max Beerbohm has admirably expressed in speaking of certain congruities of dark cloth and the rigid perfection of linen. They walked with the gait of an affected snail, and they spoke at the longest intervals, dropping a sentence at about every sixth lamp-post. They crawled on past the lamp-posts. Their mien was so immovable that a fanciful description might almost say that the lamp-posts crawled past the men, as in a dream. Then the small man suddenly ran after them and said, "I want to get my hair cut. I say, do you know a little shop anywhere where they cut your hair properly? I keep on having my hair cut, but it keeps growing again." One of the tall men looked at him with the air of a pained naturalist. "Why, here is a little place," cried the small man, with a sort of imbecile cheerfulness, as the bright bulging window of a fashionable toilet saloon glowed abruptly out of the foggy twilight. "Do you know, I often find hairdressers when I walk about London. I'll lunch with you at Ciccani's, you know. I'm awfully fond of hairdressers' shops. They're miles better than those nasty butchers." And he disappeared into the doorway. The man called James continued to gaze after him, a monocle screwed into his eye. "What the devil do you make of that fellow?" he asked his companion, a pale young man with a high nose. The pale young man reflected conscientiously for some minutes, and then said, "Had a knock on his head when he was a kid, I should think." "No, I don't think it's that," replied the Honourable James Barker. "I've sometimes fancied he was a sort of artist, Lambert." "Bosh!" cried Mr. Lambert briefly. "I admit I can't make him out," resumed Barker abstractedly. He never opens his mouth without saying something so indescribably half-witted that to call him a fool seems the very feeblest attempt at characterization. But there's another thing about him that's rather funny. Do you know that he has the one collection of Japanese lacquer in Europe? Have you ever seen his books? All Greek poets and medieval French and that sort of thing. Have you ever been in his rooms? It's like being inside an amethyst. And he moves about in all that and talks like a turnip. Well, damn all books. Your blue books as well, said the ingenious Mr. Lambert, with a friendly simplicity. You ought to understand such things. What do you make of him? He's beyond me, returned Barker. But if you asked me for my opinion, I should say he was a man with a taste for nonsense, as they call it, artistic fooling, and all that kind of thing. And I seriously believe that he has talked nonsense so much that he has half bewildered his own mind, and doesn't know the difference between sanity and insanity. He has gone round the metal world, so to speak, and found the place where the East and the West are one, and extreme idiocy is as good as sense. But I can't explain these psychological games. You can't explain them to me, replied Mr. Wilfrid Lambert with candour. As they passed up the long streets toward their restaurant, the copper twilight cleared slowly to a pale yellow, and by the time they reached it, they stood discernible in a tolerable winter daylight. The Honourable James Barker, one of the most powerful officials in the English Government, by this time a rigidly official one, was a lean and elegant young man with a blank, handsome face and bleak blue eyes. He had a great amount of intellectual capacity, of that peculiar kind which raises a man from throne to throne, and lets him die loaded with honours, without having either amused or enlightened the mind of a single man. Wilfrid Lambert, the youth with the nose which appeared to impoverish the rest of his face, had also contributed little to the enlargement of the human spirit, but he had the honourable excuse of being a fool. Lambert would have been called a silly man. Barker, with all his cleverness, might have been called a stupid man, but mere silliness and stupidity sank into insignificance in the presence of the awful and mysterious treasures of foolishness apparently stored up in the small figure that stood waiting for them outside Cicconani's. The little man, whose name was Auberon Quin, had an appearance compounded of a baby and an owl. His round head, round eyes, seemed to have been designed by nature playfully with a pair of compasses. His flat dark hair and preposterously long frock coat gave him something of the look of a child's Noah. When he entered a room of strangers they mistook him for a small boy, and wanted to take him on their knees until he spoke, when they perceived that a boy would have been more intelligent. "I have been waiting quite a long time," said Quin mildly. "It's awfully funny I should see you coming up the street at last." "Why?" asked Lambert, staring. "You told us to come here yourself." "My mother used to tell people to come places," said the sage. They were about to turn into the restaurant with a resigned air, when their eyes were caught by something in the street. The weather, though cold and blank, was now quite clear, and across the dull brown of the wood pavement and between the dull grey terraces was moving something not to be seen for miles around, not to be seen perhaps at that time in England. A man dressed in bright colours. A small crowd hung on the man's heels. He was a tall, stately man, clad in a military uniform of brilliant green, splashed with great silver facings. From the shoulder swung a short green furrowed cloak, somewhat like that of a hussar, the lining of which gleamed every now and then with a kind of tawny crimson. His breast glittered with medals, round his neck was the red ribbon and star of some foreign order, and a long straight sword with a blazing hilt trailed and clattered along the pavement. At this time the pacific and utilitarian development of Europe had relegated all such customs to the museums. The only remaining force, the small but well-organized police, were attired in a sombre and hygienic manner. But even those who remembered the last Life Guards and Lancers who disappeared in 1912 must have known at a glance that this was not, and never had been, an English uniform, and this conviction would have been heightened by the yellow aquiline face, like Dante, carved in bronze, which rose crowned with white hair out of the green military collar, a keen and distinguished, but not an English face. The magnificence with which the green-clad gentleman walked down the centre of the road would be something difficult to express in human language, for it was an ingrained simplicity and an arrogance, something in the mere carriage of the head and body, which made ordinary moderns in the street stare after him. But it had comparatively little to do with actual conscious gestures or expression. In the manner of these merely temporary movements, the man appeared to be rather worried and inquisitive, but he was inquisitive with the inquisitiveness of a despot, and worried as with the responsibilities of a god. The men who lounged and wondered behind him followed partly with an astonishment at his brilliant uniform, that is to say, partly because of that instinct which makes us all follow one who looks like a madman, but far more because of that instinct which makes all men follow and worship anyone who chooses to behave like a king. He had so sublime an extent, that great quality of royalty, and almost imbecilic unconsciousness of everybody, that people went after him as they do after kings, to see what would be the first thing or person he would take notice of. And all the time, as we have said, in spite of his quiet splendour, there was an air about him as if he were looking for somebody, an expression of inquiry. Suddenly that expression of inquiry vanished, none could tell why, and was replaced by an expression of contentment. Amid the rapt attention of the mob of idlers, the magnificent green gentleman deflected himself from his direct course down the centre of the road, and walked to one side of it. He came to a halt opposite to a large poster of Coleman's mustard, erected on a wooden boarding. His spectators almost held their breath. He took from a small pocket in his uniform a little penknife. With this he made a slash at the stretched paper. Completing the rest of the operation with his fingers, he tore off a strip or rag of paper, yellow in colour and wholly irregular in outline. Then, for the first time, the great being addressed his adoring onlookers. "Can anyone," he said, with a pleasing foreign accent, "lend me a pin?" Mr. Lambert, who happened to be nearest, and who carried innumerable pins for the purpose of attaching innumerable buttonholes, lent him one, which was received with extravagant but dignified bows and hyperboles of thanks. The gentleman in green then, with every appearance of being gratified and even puffed up, pinned the piece of yellow paper to the green silk and silver lace adornments of his breast. Then he turned his eyes round again, searching and unsatisfied. "Anything else I can do, sir?" asked Lambert, with the absurd politeness of the English when once embarrassed. "Red," said the stranger vaguely. "Red." "I beg your pardon?" "I beg yours also, Señor," said the stranger, bowing. "I was wondering whether any of you had any red about you." "Any red about us? Well, really, no. I don't think I have. I used to carry a red bandana once, but—" "Barker," asked Auberon Quin suddenly, "where's your red cockatoo? Where is your red cockatoo?" "What do you mean?" asked Barker desperately. "What cockatoo? You've never seen me with any cockatoo." "I know," said Auberon, vaguely mollified. "Where's it been all the time?" Barker swung round, not without resentment. "I am sorry, sir," he said, shortly but civilly. "None of us seem to have anything red to lend you. But why, if one may ask?" "I thank you, Señor. It is nothing. I can, since there is nothing else, fulfil my own requirements." And standing for a second of thought, with the penknife in his hand, he stabbed his left palm. The blood fell with so full a stream that it struck the stones without dripping. The foreigner pulled out his handkerchief and tore a piece from it with his teeth. The rag was immediately soaked in scarlet. "Since you are so generous, Señor," he said, "another pin, perhaps?" Lambert held one out, with eyes protruding like a frog's. The red linen was pinned beside the yellow paper, and the foreigner took off his hat. "I have to thank you all, gentlemen," he said, and wrapping the remainder of the handkerchief round his bleeding hand, he resumed his walk with an overwhelming stateliness. While all the rest paused in some disorder, Little Mr. Auberon Quin ran after the stranger and stopped him with hat in hand. Considerably to everybody's astonishment, he addressed him in purest Spanish. "Señor," he said in that language, "pardon a hospitality, perhaps indiscreet, towards one who appears to be a distinguished but solitary guest in London. Will you do me and my friends, with whom you have held some conversation, the honour of lunching with us at the adjoining restaurant?" The man in the green uniform had turned a fiery colour of pleasure at the mere sound of his own language, and he accepted the invitation with that profusion of bows which so often shows, in the case of the southern races, the falsehood of the notion that ceremony has nothing to do with feeling. "Señor," he said, "your language is my own, but all my love for my people shall not lead me to deny to yours the possession of so chivalrous an entertainer. Let me say that the tongue is Spanish, but the heart is English." And he passed, with the rest, into Chickananis. "Now, perhaps," said Barker, over the fish and sherry, intensely polite, but burning with curiosity, "perhaps it would be rude of me to ask why you did that?" "Did what, Señor?" asked the guest, who spoke English quite well, though in a manner indefinably American. "Well," said the Englishman in some confusion, "I mean, tore a strip off the hoarding and cut yourself." "To tell you that, Señor," answered the other, with a certain sad pride, "involves merely telling you who I am. I am Juan del Fuego, President of Nicaragua." The manner with which the President of Nicaragua leant back and drank his sherry showed that to him this explanation covered all the facts observed, and a great deal more. Barker's brow, however, was still a little clouded. "And the yellow paper," he began, with anxious friendliness, "and the red rag?" "The yellow paper and the red rag," said Fuego, with indescribable grandeur, "are the colours of Nicaragua." "But Nicaragua," began Barker, with great hesitation. "Nicaragua is no longer a—" "Nicaragua has been conquered like Athens. Nicaragua has been annexed like Jerusalem," cried the old man, with amazing fire. "The Yankee and the German and the brute powers of modernity have trampled it with the hoofs of oxen, but Nicaragua is not dead. Nicaragua is an idea." Auberon Quin suggested timidly, "A brilliant idea." "Yes," said the foreigner, snatching at the word, "you are right, generous Englishman. An idea brilliant, a burning thought. Señor, you asked me why. In my desire to see the colours of my country, I snatched at paper and blood. Can you not understand the ancient sanctity of colours? The Church has her symbolic colours, and think of what colours mean to us. Think of the position of one like myself, who can see nothing but those two colours, nothing but the red and the yellow. To me all shapes are equal. All common and noble things are in a democracy of combination. Wherever there is a field of marigolds and the red cloak of an old woman, there is Nicaragua. Wherever there is a field of poppies and a yellow patch of sand, there is Nicaragua. Wherever there is a lemon and a red sunset, there is my country. Wherever I see a red pillar box and a yellow sunset, there my heart beats. Blood and a splash of mustard can be my heraldry. If there be yellow mud and red mud in the same ditch, it is better to me than white stars." "And if," said Quin, with equal enthusiasm, "there should happen to be yellow wine and red wine at the same lunch, you could not confine yourself to sherry. Let me order some Burgundy, and complete, as it were, a sort of Nicaraguan heraldry in your inside." Barker was fiddling with his knife, and was evidently making up his mind to say something with the intense nervousness of the amiable Englishman. "I am to understand, then," he said at last, with a cough, "that you were the President of Nicaragua when it made its one must of course agree its quite heroic resistance to The ex-President of Nicaragua waved his hand. "You need not hesitate in speaking to me," he said. "I am quite fully aware that the whole tendency of the world of to day is against Nicaragua and against me. I shall not consider it any diminution of your evident courtesy if you say what you think of the misfortunes that have laid my republic in ruins." Barker looked immeasurably relieved and gratified. "You are most generous, President," he said, with some hesitation over the title, "and I will take advantage of your generosity to express the doubts which, I must confess, we moderns have about such things as the Nicaraguan independence." "So your sympathies are," said Del Fuego quite calmly, "with the big nation which—" Pardon me, President," said Barker warmly. "My sympathies are with no nation. You misunderstand, I think, the modern intellect. We do not disapprove of the fire and extravagance of such commonwealths as yours, only to become more extravagant on a larger scale. We do not condemn Nicaragua because we think Britain ought to be more Nicaraguan. We do not discourage small nationalities because we wish large nationalities to have all their smallness, all their uniformity of outlook, all their exaggeration of spirit. If I differ with the greatest respect from your Nicaraguan enthusiasm, it is not because a nation or 10 nations were against you. It is because civilization was against you. We moderns believe in a great cosmopolitan civilization, one which shall include all the talents of all the absorbed peoples." "The Señor will forgive me," said the President. "May I ask the Señor how, under ordinary circumstances, he catches a wild horse?" "I never catch a wild horse," replied Barker with dignity. "Precisely," said the other. "And there ends your absorption of the talents. That is what I complain of your cosmopolitanism. When you say you want all the peoples to unite, you really mean that you want all the peoples to unite to learn the tricks of your people. If the Bedouin Arab does not know how to read, some English missionary or schoolmaster must be sent to teach him how to read. But no one ever says, 'This schoolmaster does not know how to ride on a camel. Let us pay a Bedouin to teach him.' You say your civilization will include all talents. Will it? Do you really mean to say that at the moment when the Eskimo has learnt to vote for a county council, you will have learnt to spear a walrus? I recur to the example I gave. In Nicaragua we had a way of catching wild horses by lassoing the 4 feet, which was supposed to be the best in South America. If you are going to include all the talents, go and do it. If not, permit me to say what I have always said, that something went out from the world when Nicaragua was civilized." "Something, perhaps," replied Barker, "but that something a mere barbarian dexterity. I do not know that I could chip flints as well as a primeval man, but I know that civilization can make these knives which are better, and I trust to civilization." "You have good authority," answered the Nicaraguan. "Many clever men like you have trusted to civilization. Many clever Babylonians, many clever Egyptians, many clever men at the end of Rome. Can you tell me, in a world that is flagrant with the failures of civilization, what there is particularly immortal about yours?" "I think you do not quite understand, President, what ours is," answered Barker. "You judge it rather as if England was still a poor and pugnacious island. You have been long out of Europe. Many things have happened." "And what," asked the other, "would you call the summary of those things?" "The summary of those things," answered Barker with great animation, "is that we are rid of the superstitions. And in becoming so, we have not merely become rid of the superstitions which have been most frequently and most enthusiastically so described. The superstition of big nationalities is bad, but the superstition of small nationalities is worse. The superstition of reverencing our own country is bad, but the superstition of reverencing other people's countries is worse. It is so everywhere, and in 100 ways. The superstition of monarchy is bad, and the superstition of aristocracy is bad, but the superstition of democracy is the worst of all." The old gentleman opened his eyes with some surprise. "Are you then," he said, "no longer a democracy in England?" Barker laughed. "The situation invites paradox," he said. "We are in a sense the purest democracy. We have become a despotism. Have you not noticed how continually in history democracy becomes despotism? People call it the decay of democracy. It is simply its fulfilment. Why take the trouble to number and register and enfranchise all the innumerable John Robinsons, when you can take one John Robinson with the same intellect or lack of intellect as all the rest, and have done with it? The old idealistic republicans used to found democracy on the idea that all men were equally intelligent. Believe me, the sane and enduring democracy is founded on the fact that all men are equally idiotic. Why should we not choose out of them one as much as another? All that we want for government is a man not criminal and insane, who can rapidly look over some petitions and sign some proclamations. To think what time was wasted in arguing about the House of Lords, Tories saying it ought to be preserved because it was clever, and Radicals saying it ought to be destroyed because it was stupid. And all the time no one saw that it was right because it was stupid, because that chance mob of ordinary men, thrown there by accident of blood, were a great democratic protest against the lower house, against the eternal insolence of the aristocracy of talents. We have established now in England the thing towards which all systems have dimly groped, the dull popular despotism without illusions. We want one man at the head of our state, not because he is brilliant or virtuous, but because he is one man, and not a chattering crowd. To avoid the possible chance of hereditary diseases or such things, we have abandoned hereditary monarchy. The King of England is chosen like a juryman upon an official rotation list. Beyond that, the whole system is quietly despotic, and we have not found it raise a murmur. "Do you really mean," asked the President incredulously, "that you choose any ordinary man that comes to hand and make him despot, that you trust to the chance of some alphabetical list?" "And why not?" cried Barker. "Did not half the historical nations trust to the chance of the eldest sons of eldest sons, and did not half of them get on tolerably well? To have a perfect system is impossible. To have a system is indispensable. All hereditary monarchies were a matter of luck. So are alphabetical monarchies. Can you find a deep philosophical meaning in the difference between the Stuarts and the Hanoverians? Believe me, I will undertake to find a deep philosophical meaning in the contrast between the dark tragedy of the A's and the solid success of the B's." "And you risk it," asked the other, "though the man may be a tyrant or a cynic or a criminal?" "We risk it," answered the Barker, with a perfect placidity. "Suppose he is a tyrant, he is still a check on 100 other tyrants. Suppose he is a cynic, it is to his interest to govern well. Suppose he is a criminal, by removing poverty and substituting power, we put a check on his criminality. In short, by substituting despotism, we have put a total check on one criminal and a partial check on all the rest." The Nicaraguan old gentleman leaned over with a queer expression in his eyes. "My Church, sir," he said, "has taught me to respect faith. I do not wish to speak with any disrespect of yours, however fantastic. But do you really mean that you will trust to the ordinary man, the man who happened to come next, as a good despot?" "I do," said Barker simply. "He may not be a good man, but he will be a good despot. For when he comes to mere business routine of governing, he will endeavour to do ordinary justice. Do we not assume the same thing in a jury?" The old President smiled. "I don't know," he said, "that I have any particular objection in detail to your excellent scheme of government. My only objection is a quite personal one. It is that if I were asked whether I would belong to it, I should ask, first of all, if I was not permitted as an alternative to be a toad in a ditch. That is all. You cannot argue with the choice of the soul." "Of the soul?" said Barker, knitting his brows. "I cannot pretend to say anything. But speaking in the interests of the public." Mr. Auberon Quin rose suddenly to his feet. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen," he said, "I will step out for a moment into the air." "I am so sorry, Auberon," said Lambert good-naturedly. "Do you feel bad?" "Not bad exactly," said Auberon, with self-restraint. "Rather good, if anything. Strangely and richly good. The fact is, I want to reflect a little on those beautiful words that have just been uttered. Speaking, yes, that was the phrase, speaking in the interest of the public. One cannot get the honey from such things without being alone for a little." "Is he really off his chump, do you think?" asked Lambert. The old President looked after him with queerly vigilant eyes. "He is a man, I think," he said, "who cares for nothing but a joke. He is a dangerous man." Lambert laughed in the act of lifting some macaroni to his mouth. "Dangerous?" he said. "You don't know little Quin, sir." "Every man is dangerous," said the old man without moving, "who cares only for one thing. I was once dangerous myself." And with a pleasant smile he finished his coffee and rose, bowing profoundly, passed out into the fog, which had again grown dense and sombre. 3 days afterwards they heard that he had died quietly in lodgings in Soho. Drowned somewhere else in the dark sea of fog was a little figure, shaking and quaking, with what might at first sight have seemed terror or ague, but which was really that strange malady, a lonely laughter. He was repeating over and over to himself with a rich accent, "But speaking in the interests of the public." End of chapter 2, book 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Napoleon of Notting Hill by G.K. Chesterton. Book 1, Chapter 3. The Hill of Humour. "In a little square garden of yellow roses beside the sea," said Auberon Quin, "there was a Nonconformist minister who had never been to Wimbledon. His family did not understand his sorrow or the strange look in his eyes, but one day they repented their neglect, for they heard that a body had been found on the shore, battered, but wearing patent leather boots. As it happened, it turned out not to be the minister at all, but in the dead man's pocket there was a return ticket to Maidstone." There was a short pause, as Quin and his friends Barker and Lambert went swinging on through the slushy grass of Kensington Gardens. Then Auberon resumed. "That story," he said reverently, "is the test of humour." They walked on further and faster, wading through higher grass as they began to climb a slope. "I perceive," continued Auberon, "that you have passed the test, and consider the anecdote excruciatingly funny, since you say nothing. Only coarse humour is received with pothouse applause. The great anecdote is received in silence, like a benediction. You felt pretty benedicted, didn't you, Barker?" "I saw the point," said Barker, somewhat loftily. "Do you know," said Quin, with a sort of idiot gaiety, "I have lots of stories as good as that. Listen to this one." And he slightly cleared his throat. Dr. Polycarp was, as you all know, an unusually sallow bimetallist. There, people of wide experience would say, "There goes the sallowest bimetallist in Cheshire." Once this was said so that he overheard it. It was said by an actuary, tinder in a sunset of mauve and grey. Polycarp turned upon him. "Sallow!" he cried fiercely. "Sallow! Quis tulerat gratios de sedentione querentis." It was said that no actuary ever made game of Dr. Polycarp again. Barker nodded with a simple sagacity. Lambert only grunted. "Here is another," continued the insatiable Quin. "In a hollow of the grey-green hills of rainy Ireland lived an old, old woman, whose uncle was always Cambridge at the boat race. But in her grey-green hollows she knew nothing of this. She didn't know that there was a boat race. Also, she did not know that she had an uncle. She had heard of nobody at all except of George the First, of whom she had heard, I know not why, and in whose historical memory she put her simple trust. And by, in God's good time, it was discovered that this uncle of hers was not really her uncle, and they came and told her so. She smiled through her tears and said only, 'Virtue is its own reward.'" Again there was a silence, and then Lambert said, "It seems a bit mysterious." "Mysterious!" cried the other. "The true humour is mysterious. Do you not realise the chief incident of the 19th and 20th centuries?" "And what is that?" asked Lambert, shortly. "It is very simple," replied the other. "Hitherto it was the ruin of a joke that people did not see it. Now it is the sublime victory of a joke that people do not see it. Humour, my friends, is the one sanctity remaining to mankind. It is the one thing you are thoroughly afraid of. Look at that tree." His interlocutors looked vaguely towards a beech that leant out towards them from the ridge of the hill. "If," said Mr. Quin, "I were to say that you did not see the great truths of science exhibited by that tree, though they stared any man of intellect in the face, what would you think or say? You would merely regard me as a pedant with some unimportant theory about vegetable cells. If I were to say that you did not see in that tree the vile mismanagement of local politics, you would dismiss me as a Socialist crank with some particular fad about public parks. If I were to say that you were guilty of the supreme blasphemy of looking at that tree and not seeing in it a new religion, a special revelation of God, you would simply say I was a mystic, and think no more about me. But if," and he lifted a pontifical hand, "if I say that you cannot see the humour of that tree, and that I see the humour of it, my God, you will roll about at my feet." He paused a moment, and then resumed. "Yes, a sense of humour, a weird and delicate sense of humour, is the new religion of mankind. It is towards that men will strain themselves with the asceticism of saints. Exercises, spiritual exercises, will be set in it. It will be asked, 'Can you see the humour of this iron railing? Or can you see the humour of this field of corn? Can you see the humour of the stars? Can you see the humour of the sunsets?' How often I have laughed myself to sleep over a violet sunset." "Quite so," said Mr. Barker, with an intelligent embarrassment. "Let me tell you another story. How often it happens that the M.P.s for Essex are less punctual than one would suppose. The least punctual Essex M.P., perhaps, was James Wilson, who said, in the very act of plucking a poppy—" Lambert suddenly faced round and stuck his stick in the ground in a defiant attitude. "Auberon," he said, "chuck it. I won't stand it. It's all bosh." Both men stared at him, for there was something very explosive about the words, as if they had been corked up painfully for a long time. "You have begun, Quin. No?" "I don't care a curse," said Lambert violently, "whether I have a delicate sense of humour or not. I won't stand it. It's all a confounded fraud. There is no joke in those infernal tales at all. You know there isn't, as well as I do." "Well," replied Quin slowly, "it is true that I, with my rather gradual mental process, did not see any joke in them. But the finer sense of Barker perceived it." Barker turned a fierce red, but continued to stare at the horizon. "You ass," said Lambert. "Why can't you be like other people? Why can't you say something really funny, or hold your tongue? The man who sits on his hat in a pantomime is a long sight funnier than you are." Quin regarded him steadily. They had reached the top of the ridge, and the wind struck their faces. "Lambert," said Auberon, "you are a great and good man, though I'm hanged if you look it. You are more. You are a great revolutionist or deliverer of the world, and I look forward to seeing you carved in marble between Luther and Danton, if possible, in your present attitude, the hat slightly on one side. I said, as I came up the hill, that the new humour was the last of the religions. You have made it the last of the superstitions. But let me give you a very serious warning. Be careful how you ask me to do anything outré, to imitate the man in the pantomime, and to sit on my hat, because I am a man whose soul has been emptied of all pleasures but folly, and for 2 pence I'd do it." "Do it, then," said Lambert, swinging his stick impatiently. "It'd be funnier than the bosh you and Barker talk." Quin, standing on the top of the hill, stretched his hand out towards the main avenue of Kensington Gardens. 200 yards away," he said, "are all your fashionable acquaintances, with nothing on earth to do but stare at each other and at us. We are standing upon an elevation under the open sky, a peak, as it were, of fantasy, a Sinai of humour. We are in a great pulpit or platform, lit up with sunlight, and half London can see us. Be careful how you suggest things to me, for there is in me a madness which goes beyond martyrdom, the madness of an utterly idle man." "I don't know what you're talking about," said Lambert contemptuously. "I only know I'd rather you stood on your silly head than talked so much." "Auberon, for goodness' sake!" cried Barker, springing forward, but he was too late. Faces from all the benches and avenues were turned in their direction. Groups stopped and small crowds collected, and sharp sunlight picked out the whole scene in blue, green, and black, like a picture in a child's toy book. And on the top of the small hill Mr. Auberon Quin stood with considerable athletic neatness upon his head, and waved his patent leather boots in the air. "For God's sake, Quin, get up, and don't be an idiot," cried Barker, wringing his hands. "We shall have the whole town here." "Yes, get up, man," said Lambert, amused and annoyed. "I was only fooling. Get up." Auberon did so with a bound, and flinging his hat higher than the trees, proceeded to hop about on one leg with a serious expression. Barker stamped wildly. "Oh, let's go home, Barker, and leave him," said Lambert. "Some of your proper and correct police will look after him. Here they come." Two grave-looking men in quiet uniforms came up the hill towards them. One held a paper in his hand. "There he is, officer," said Lambert cheerfully. "We ain't responsible for him." The officer looked at the capering Mr. Quin with a quiet eye. "We have not come, gentlemen," he said, "about what I think you are alluding to. We have come from headquarters to announce the selection of His Majesty the King. It is the rule inherited from the old regime that the news should be brought to the new sovereign immediately, wherever he is. So we have followed you across Kensington Gardens." Barker's eyes were blazing in his pale face. He was consumed with ambition throughout his life. With a certain dull magnanimity of the intellect, he had really believed in the chance method of selecting despots. But this sudden suggestion that the selection might have fallen upon him unnerved him with pleasure. "Which of us?" he began, and the respectful official interrupted him. "Not you, sir, I am sorry to say. If I may be permitted to say so, we know your services to the Government, and we should be very thankful if it were. The choice has fallen—" "God bless my soul," said Lambert, jumping back 2 paces. "Not me. Don't say I'm an autocrat of all the Russias." "No, sir," said the officer, with a slight cough and a glance towards Auberon, who was at that moment putting his head between his legs and making a noise like a cow. "The gentleman whom we have to congratulate seems at the moment occupied." "Not Quin!" shrieked Barker, rushing up to him. "It can't be! Auberon, for God's sake, pull yourself together. You've been made king." With his head still upside down between his legs, Mr. Quin answered modestly, "I am not worthy. I cannot reasonably claim to equal the great men who have previously swayed the sceptre of Britain. Perhaps the only peculiarity that I can claim is that I am probably the first monarch that ever spoke out his soul to the people of England, with his head and body in this position. This may in some sense give me, to quote a poem that I wrote in my youth, a nobler office on the earth than valour, power of brain, or birth could give the warrior kings of old, the intellect clarified by this posture." Lambert and Barker made a kind of rush at him. "Don't you understand?" cried Lambert. "It's not a joke. They've really made you king. By gosh, they must have rum taste." "The great bishops of the Middle Ages," said Quin, kicking his legs in the air as he was dragged up more or less upside down, "were in the habit of refusing the honour of election 3 times and then accepting it. A mere matter of detail separates me from those great men. I will accept the post 3 times and refuse it afterwards. Oh, I will toil for you, my faithful people. You shall have a banquet of humour." By this time he had been landed the right way up, and the 2 men were still trying in vain to impress him with the gravity of the situation. "Did you not tell me, Wilfrid Lambert," he said, "that I should be of more public value if I adopted a more popular form of humour? And when should a popular form of humour be more firmly riveted upon me than now, when I have become the darling of a whole people? Officer," he continued, addressing the startled messenger, "are there no ceremonies to celebrate my entry into the city?" "Ceremonies," began the official with embarrassment, "have been more or less neglected for some little time, and " Auberon Quin began gradually to take off his coat. "All ceremony," he said, "consists in the reversal of the obvious. Thus men, when they wish to be priests or judges, dress up like women. Kindly help me on with this coat." And he held it out. "But, your Majesty," said the officer, after a moment's bewilderment and manipulation, "you're putting it on with the tails in front." "The reversal of the obvious," said the King calmly, "is as near as we can come to ritual with our imperfect apparatus. Lead on." The rest of that afternoon and evening was to Barker and Lambert a nightmare which they could not properly realise or recall. The King, with his coat on the wrong way, went towards the streets that were awaiting him, and the old Kensington Palace, which was the royal residence. As he passed small groups of men, the groups turned into crowds, and gave forth sounds which seemed strange in welcoming an autocrat. Barker walked behind, his brain reeling, and as the crowds grew thicker and thicker, the sounds became more and more unusual, and when he had reached the great market-place opposite the church, Barker knew that he had reached it, though he was roods behind, because a cry went up such as had never before greeted any of the kings of the earth. The end of chapter 3. End of book 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Napoleon of Notting Hill by G. K. Chesterton. Section 4. Book 2, Chapter 1. The Charter of the Cities. Lambert was standing bewildered outside the door of the King's apartments, amid the scurry of astonishment and ridicule. He was just passing out into the street in a dazed manner when James Barker dashed by him. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To stop all this tomfoolery, of course," replied Barker, and he disappeared into the room. He entered it headlong, slamming the door and slapping his incomparable silk hat on the table. His mouth opened, but before he could speak the King said, "Your hat, if you please." Fidgeting with his fingers and scarcely knowing what he was doing, the young politician held it out. The King placed it on his own chair and sat on it. "A quaint old custom," he explained, smiling above the ruins. "When the King receives the representatives of the House of Barker, the hat of the latter is immediately destroyed in this manner. It represents the absolute finality of the act of homage expressed in the removal of it. It declares that never until that hat shall once more appear upon your head, a contingency which I firmly believe to be remote, shall the House of Barker rebel against the Crown of England." Barker stood with clenched fists and shaking lip. "Your jokes," he began, "and my property," and then exploded with an oath and stopped again. "Continue, continue," said the King, waving his hands. "What does it all mean?" cried the other, with a gesture of passionate rationality. "Are you mad?" "Not in the least," replied the King, pleasantly. "Madmen are always serious. They go mad from lack of humour. You're looking serious yourself, James." "Why can't you keep it to your own private life?" expostulated the other. "You've got plenty of money and plenty of houses now to play the fool in. But the interests of the public—" "Epigrammatic," said the King, shaking his fingers sadly at him. "None of your daring scintillations here. As to why I don't do it in private, I rather fail to understand your question. The answer is of comparative limpidity. I don't do it in private because it is funnier to do it in public. You appear to think that it would be amusing to be dignified in the banquet hall and in the street and at my own fireside. I could procure a fireside to keep the company in a roar. But that is what every one does. Every one is grave in public and funny in private. My sense of humour suggests the reversal of this. It suggests that one should be funny in public and solemn in private. I desire to make the state functions, parliaments, coronations, and so on, one roaring, old-fashioned pantomime. But, on the other hand, I shut myself up alone in a small storeroom for 2 hours a day, where I am so dignified that I come out quite ill. By this time Barker was walking up and down the room, his frock coat flapping like the black wings of a bird. "Well, you will ruin the country, that's all," he said shortly. "It seems to me," said Auberon, "that the tradition of 10 centuries is being broken, and the House of Barker is rebelling against the Crown of England. It would be with regret, for I admire your appearance, that I should be obliged forcibly to decorate your head with the remains of this hat. But what I can't understand," said Barker, flinging up his fingers with a feverish American movement, "is why you don't care about anything else but your games." The King stopped sharply in the act of lifting the silken remnants, dropped them, and walked up to Barker, looking at him steadily. "I made a kind of vow," he said, "that I would not talk seriously, which always means answering silly questions. But the strong man will always be gentle with politicians. The shape my scornful looks deride required a god to form, if I may so theologically express myself. And for some reason I cannot in the least understand, I feel impelled to answer that question of yours, and to answer it as if there were really such a thing in the world as a serious subject. You ask me why I don't care for anything else. Can you tell me, in the name of all gods you don't believe in, why I should care for anything else?" "Don't you realise common public necessities?" cried Barker. "Is it possible that a man of your intelligence does not know that it is in every one's interest? Don't you believe in Zoroaster? Is it possible that you neglect Mumbo Jumbo?" returned the King with startling animation. "Does a man of your intelligence come to me with these damned early Victorian ethics? If on studying my features and manner you detect any particular resemblance to the Prince Consort, I assure you you are mistaken. Did Herbert Spencer ever convince you? Did he ever convince anybody? Did he ever for one mad moment convince himself that it must be to the interest of the individual to feel a public spirit? Do you believe that if you rule your department badly, you stand any more chance, or one half the chance, of being guillotined than an angler stands of being pulled into the river by a strong pike? Herbert Spencer refrained from theft for the same reason that he refrained from wearing feathers in his hair, because he was an English gentleman with different tastes. I am an English gentleman with different tastes. He liked philosophy, I like art. He liked writing 10 books on the nature of human society. I like to see the Lord Chamberlain walking in front of me with a piece of paper pinned to his coat tails. It is my humour. Are you answered? At any rate, I have said my last serious word to-day, and my last serious word, I trust, for the remainder of my life in this paradise of fools. The remainder of my conversation with you to-day, which I trust will be long and stimulating, I propose to conduct in a new language of my own, by means of rapid and symbolic movements of the left leg." And he began to pirouette slowly around the room with a preoccupied expression. Barker ran round the room after him, bombarding him with demands and entreaties, but he received no response except in the new language. He came out banging the door again, and sick like a man coming on shore. As he strode along the streets he found himself suddenly opposite Cicconani's restaurant, and for some reason there rose up before him the green fantastic figure of the Spanish general, standing as he had seen him last at the door, with the words on his lips, "You cannot argue with the choice of the soul." The King came out from his dancing with the air of a man of business, legitimately tired. He put on an overcoat, lit a cigar, and went out to the purple night. "I will go," he said, "and mingle with the people." He passed swiftly up a street in the neighbourhood of Notting Hill, when suddenly he felt a hard object driven into his waistcoat. He paused, put up his single eyeglasses, and beheld a boy with a wooden sword and a paper cocked hat wearing that expression of awed satisfaction which a child contemplates his work when he has hit someone very hard. The King gazed thoughtfully for some time at his assailant, and slowly took a notebook from his breast pocket. "I have a few notes," he said, "for my dying speech." And he turned over the leaves. "Dying speeches for political assassination, ditto. If by former friend, dying speech for death at hands of injured husband, dying speech for same, cynical. I'm not quite sure which meets the present." "I am the king of the castle," said the boy, truculently, and very pleased with nothing in particular. The King was a kind-hearted man, and very fond of children, like all people who are fond of the ridiculous. "Infant," he said, "I am glad you are so stalwart a defender of your old inviolate Notting Hill. Look up nightly to that peak, my child, where it lifts itself among the stars, so ancient, so lonely, so unutterably Notting. So long as you are ready to die for the sacred mountain, even if it were ringed with all the armies of Bayswater." The King stopped suddenly, and his eyes shone. "Perhaps," he said, "perhaps the noblest of all my conceptions, a revival of the arrogance of the old mediaeval cities applied to our glorious suburbs. Clapham with a city guard, Wimbledon with a city wall, Surbiton tolling a bell to raise its citizens, West Hampstead going into battle with its own banner. It shall be done. I, the King, have said it." And hastily presenting the boy with half-crown, remarking, "For the war chest of Notting Hill," he ran violently home at such a rate of speed that crowds followed him for miles. On reaching his study he ordered a cup of coffee, and plunged into profound meditation upon the project. At length he called his favourite equerry, Captain Bowler, for whom he had a deep affection, founded principally upon the shape of his whiskers. "Bowler," he said, "isn't there some Society of Historical Research, or something, of which I am an honorary member?" "Yes, sir," said Captain Bowling, rubbing his nose. "You are a member of the Encouragers of Egyptian Renaissance, and the Teutonic Tombs Club, and the Society for the Recovery of London Antiquities, and—" "That is admirable," said the King. "The London Antiquities does my trick. Go to the Society for the Recovery of London Antiquities, and speak to the secretaries and their sub-secretary and their president and their vice-president, saying, 'The King of England is proud, but the honorary member of the Society for the Recovery of London Antiquities is prouder than kings. I should like to tell you of certain discoveries I have made touching the neglected traditions of the London boroughs. The revelations may cause some excitement, stirring burning memories and touching old wounds in Shepherd's Bush and Bayswater, in Pimlico and South Kensington.'" The King hesitates, but the honorary member is firm. "I approach you, invoking the vows of my initiation, the sacred 7 cats, the poker of perfection, and the ordeal of the indescribable instant. Forgive me if I mix you up with the Clan of Gael, or some other club I belong to, and ask you to permit me to read a paper at your next meeting on the wars of the London boroughs. Say all this to the Society, Bowler. Remember it very carefully, for it is most important, and I have forgotten it altogether. And send me another cup of coffee and some of the cigars that we keep for vulgar and successful people. I am going to write my paper." The Society for the Recovery of London Antiquities met a month after in a corrugated iron hall on the outskirts of one of the southern suburbs of London. A large number of people had collected there, under the coarse and glaring gas jets, when the King arrived, perspiring and genial. On taking off his great coat he was perceived to be in evening dress, wearing the Garter. His appearance at the small table, adorned only with a glass of water, was received with respectful cheering. The chairman, Mr. Huggins, said that he was sure they had all been pleased to listen to such distinguished lectures as they had heard for some time past. "Hear, hear." Mr. Burton, "Hear, hear." Mr. Cambridge, Professor King, loud and continued cheers. Our old friend Peter Jessup, Sir William White, loud laughter, and other eminent men had done honour to their little venture. Cheers. But there were other circumstances which lent a certain unique quality to the present occasion. "Hear, hear." So far as his recollection went, and in connection with the Society for the Recovery of London Antiquities, it went very far. Loud cheers. He did not remember that any of their lecturers had borne the title of King. He would therefore call upon King Auberon briefly to address the meeting. The King began by saying that this speech might be regarded as the first declaration of his new policy for the nation. At this supreme hour of my life I feel that to no one but the members of the Society for the Recovery of London Antiquities can I open my heart. Cheers! If the word turns upon my policy, and the storms of popular hostility begin to rise, no, no, I feel that it is here, with my brave recoverers around me, that I can best meet them sword in hand. Loud cheers. His Majesty then went on to explain that now old age was creeping upon him, he proposed to devote his remaining strength to bringing about a keener sense of local patriotism in the various municipalities of London. How few of them knew of the legends of their own boroughs! How many there were who had never heard of the true origin of the Wink of Wandsworth! What a large proportion of the younger generation in Chelsea neglected to perform the old Chelsea chuff! Pimlico no longer pumped the Pimlies. Battersea had forgotten the name of Blick. There was a short silence, and then a voice said, "Shame!" The King continued, "Being called, however unworthily, to this high estate, I have resolved that, so far as possible, this neglect shall cease. I desire no military glory. I lay claim to no constitutional equality with Justinian or Alfred. If I can go down to history as the man who saved from extinction a few old English customs, if our descendants can say that it was through this man, humble as he was, that the 10 turnips are still eaten at Fulham, and the Putney parish councillor still shaves one half of his head, I shall look my great fathers reverently, but not fearfully, in the face, when I go down to the last house of kings." The King paused, visibly affected, but collecting himself, resumed once more. "I trust that to very few of you at least I need to dwell on the sublime origins of these legends. The very names of your boroughs bear witness to them. So long as Hammersmith is called Hammersmith, its people will live in the shadow of that primal hero, the blacksmith, who led the democracy of the Broad Way into battle till he drove the chivalry of Kensington before him and overthrew them at that place which, in honour of the best blood of the defeated aristocracy, is still called Kensington Gore. Men of Hammersmith will not fail to remember that the very name of Kensington originated from the lips of their hero. For at the great banquet of reconciliation held after the war, when the disdainful oligarchs declined to join in the songs of the men of the Broadway, which are to this day of a rude and popular character, the great Republican leader, with his rough humour, said the words which are written in gold upon his monument: "Little birds that can sing and won't sing must be made to sing," so that the Eastern Knights were called Cansings or Kensings ever afterwards. But you also have great memories, O men of Kensington. You showed that you could sing, and sing great war songs, even after the dark day of Kensington Gore. History will not forget those 3 knights who guarded your disordered retreat from Hyde Park, so called from your hiding there. Those 3 knights after whom Knightsbridge is named. Nor will it forget the day of your re-emergence, purged in the fire of calamity, cleansed of your oligarchic corruptions, when sword in hand you drove the empire of Hammersmith back mile by mile, swept it past its own Broadway, and broke it at last in a battle so long and bloody that the birds of prey have left their name upon it. Men have called it with austere irony the Ravenscourt. I shall not, I trust, wound the patriotism of Bayswater, or the lonelier pride of Brompton, or that of any other historic township, by taking these 2 special examples. I select them not because they are more glorious than the rest, but partly from personal association. I am myself descended from one of the 3 heroes of Knightsbridge, and partly from the consciousness that I am an amateur antiquarian and cannot presume to deal with times and places more remote and more mysterious. It is not for me to settle the questions between 2 such men as Professor Hugg and Sir William Whisky, as to whether Notting Hill means Nutting Hill, in allusion to the rich woods which no longer cover it, or whether it is a corruption of Nothing Ill, referring to its reputation among the ancients as an earthly paradise. When a Podkins and a Jossy confessed themselves doubtful about the boundaries of West Kensington, said to have been traced in the blood of oxen, I need not be ashamed to confess a similar doubt. I will ask you to excuse me from further history, and to assist me with your encouragement in dealing with the problem which faces us to day. Is this ancient spirit of the London townships to die out? Are our omnibus conductors and policemen to lose altogether that light which we see so often in their eyes, the dreamy light of old unhappy far-off things and battles long ago, to quote the words of a little-known poet who was a friend of my youth? I have resolved, as I have said, so far as possible, to preserve the eyes of policemen and omnibus conductors in their present dreamy state, or what is a state without dreams? And the remedy I propose is as follows. To-morrow morning at 10:25, if Heaven spares my life, I propose to issue a proclamation. It has been the work of my life, and is about half finished. With the assistance of a whisky soda I shall conclude the other half to-night, and my people will receive it to-morrow. All these boroughs where you were born and hoped to lay your bones shall be reinstated in their ancient magnificence. Hammersmith, Kensington, Bayswater, Chelsea, Battersea, Clapham, Balham, and 100 others. Each shall immediately build a city wall with gates to be closed at sunset. Each shall have a city guard armed to the teeth. Each shall have a banner, a coat of arms, and, if convenient, a gathering cry. I will not enter into the details now. My heart is too full. They will be found in the proclamation itself. You will all, however, be subject to enrolment in the local city guards, to be summoned together by a thing called the tocsin, the meaning of which I am studying in my researches into history. Personally, I believe a tocsin to be some kind of highly paid official. If, therefore, any of you happen to have such a thing as a halberd in the house, I should advise you to practise with it in the garden." Here the King buried his face in his handkerchief and hurriedly left the platform, overcome by emotions. The members of the Society for the Recovery of London Antiquities rose in an indescribable state of vagueness. Some were purple with indignation. An intellectual few were purple with laughter. The great majority found their minds a blank. There remains a tradition that one pale face with burning blue eyes remained fixed upon the lecturer, and after the lecture a red-haired boy ran out of the room. End of chapter 1, book 2.